The Rest is Politics is powered by our friends at Fuse Energy.
And Fuse is a green electricity supplier, which means they generate all their energy from renewables. And they're actually offering a new bundle for anyone who switches to Fuse. And included in this, you'll be pleased to hear, is some merch. Alastair's hoodie, baseball caps, mugs. The Rest is Politics merch you may have seen on tour.
And all you got to do to get it is go to getfuse.com/politics and use the referral code politics. And so the merch is great, but more important is actually that if you do switch to Fuse, you're going to find you get your energy cheaper than with all the other big companies.
And they invest 100% of their profits back into renewables. They also now offer 24/7 support, which you can access through the Fuse app.
So dead easy, getfuse.com/politics, referral code politics, find out how to get your merch, how to switch to Fuse, and how to save yourself money.
Welcome to The Rest is Politics with me, Rory Stewart.
And me, Alastair Campbell. 1st of 2025, Rory. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you. Scottish Hogmanay happening.
Absolutely. No place on earth like Scotland at any time of the year, but especially around about now.
Well, Alastair, happy New Year. And we're going to follow a plan that you've brought together where we're going to talk through New Year resolutions, but we're going to talk about what future plans the British should have, Labour, Conservatives, Lib Dems, but also what the future might hold for Donald Trump, for Elon Musk, and what things might happen in 2025 that nobody has yet really thought about. What could this year hold? But before that, can I just quickly, cheekily ask, are you somebody who does New Year resolutions?
I kind of do New Year's resolutions, but I don't really hang on them for very long.
Very good. They last about 3 days, do they?
Yeah, maybe a week. What are yours?
I don't do them. I should start. My new resolution for the year is I'm going to get going writing a serious book this year.
Okay. Not long ago, you were talking about writing a novel. Has that gone off the boil?
It's no good, my novel.
Oh.
Unlike you, I don't think I'm able to write a novel. You've actually written novels successfully. I've decided I'm no good at the dialogue.
Oh.
Yeah.
Don't give up. No, that should be your New Year's resolution, is to be perseverant about your novel. I will have a New Year's resolution. This is the first time I can remember in about 15 years where I haven't got a book actually on the go. I wonder whether it's because the podcast is taking a lot of my...
I know, it is consuming a lot of mental energy, isn't it?
I'm just going to insert a Dominic, fuck off.
Let's start with New Year's resolutions then. So how about some political New Year's resolutions? I'm going to start with you. What should Labour's New Year resolution be?
Oh, right. Okay. Labour's New Year resolution should be, I think, pick fights with the right people and the right causes. I think one of the reasons why the Labour government is sort of had a very short honeymoon and is just sort of surrounded by this sense of negativity, partly media. The media has gone absolutely back into kind of traditional anti-Labour mode. But I think in part it's because Labour have been picking lots of fights with the wrong people.
And so you mean pensioners over winter fuel, farmers, now waspy women?
Yeah.
Just to remind people that don't know about waspy women, that's about women who get caught on a cliff edge on when their pensions were going to kick in.
Another one in Keir Starmer's reset speech just before Christmas, there is sort of picking a fight with the civil service, which wasn't necessary. This sort of, sitting in the tepid bath of complacency.
Managed decline, yeah.
I think some good fights. I think one of Tony Blair's best speeches as Labour leader, best conference speech, and actually he didn't agree that it was one of his best and he retreated from it. But I would recommend that Labour go and read Tony Blair's Forces of Conservatism speech, where the fights that we wanted to take were the fights against the people who were holding the country back. I think you could have a very good, and some of these are about thematic fights. I've been really alarmed the extent to which the fight against poverty and the fight against inequality and the fights against injustice have sort of, slightly gone off the radar. I think they should pick a fight properly, probably with Elon Musk. I know that's a dangerous thing to do, but, this is a guy who's a pretty dangerous force right now. I know you think that the super rich are taxed enough already, but the super rich who do not contribute taxes, who try to spend all their time avoiding taxes. I think there's a good fight to be had there. I think there is a good fight to be had with people who are trying to take the country back sorry to echo Kamala Harris, but on some of what the right define as woke issues, which are proper campaigns of social justice.
And just tactically, would you be picking a fight with Nigel Farage and Kemi Badenoch, or one of the two particularly, and is there a risk of putting the spotlight on Farage? How would you think about that?
Listen, the spotlight is on Farage, whether they like it or not, because the Farage is very good at getting the spotlight set upon him. I think they are both, Kemi Badenoch and Nigel Farage, are both absolutely forces of conservatism. They are people who are on the right of politics, and I think they have to be taken on. One of the reasons Nigel Farage, and he was your politician of the year, and the reason for that is because he's exploited his arrival in Parliament and his addition to the strength of his political platform. He's exploited it very, very well. That's, I think, the point that you were making. So you can't ignore him. You have to take him on in argument all the time. So I'm not saying you make him the big figure of your attacks, but he is a big part of why the country is moving to the right, and Labour's got to drag it back to the centre. Having done so very, very well in the election campaign, having won that election, but since then, I just feel they've been picking fights with the wrong people.
Yeah, that's a really, really, really good observation. My sense of where Labour's gone wrong is that they've done a lot of small things which appeal to the UK Treasury, sort of sensible, small technocratic decisions. The Treasury has always wanted to get rid of the winter fuel allowance, has always supported raising the pension age on WASPy women, has never liked the exemptions for farmers in inheritance tax. And Rachel Reeves, I think, is at the heart of this problem. I think she is thinking too much still like a civil servant, as though she's a sort of Bank of England economist still. She's doing these things which have presented to every minister. George Osborne makes jokes about this. This is basically the entire shopping list that every chancellor has been presented with for 14 years, and most of them have had the political nous not to make those their first moves. And the problem is that they don't add up to enough. Going back, I mean, you often are quite self-deprecating, interestingly, about your early stage Labour, but I think that it is true that almost everything you did felt like it was about modernisation, or it was about social justice, or it was about economic dynamism. There was a kind of sense that everything tied into this. And they almost had this with the word growth. And I think it's a terrible, terrible decision to give up on a target of growth and talk instead about this sort of slightly tepid thing that everybody basically has achieved since the 1950s of GDP per capita and rising living standards, because that would then allow them to do quite radical things instead of short-term things. And I think my final thought on that, as whenever I reflect back to my own time in government, is it is partly about Keir Starmer really working out what he thinks. It took me nearly 6 months, I remember, as a prison minister before I really worked out what the one big thing was. And for me, that was violence in prisons. And once I got it, I could then tie everything back into it. So I could explain that because the prisons were unsafe, people weren't getting educated. Because the prisons were unsafe, there was reoffending. Because the prisons were unsafe, drugs were getting in, etc. And I remember resisting it, a bit like Keir is at the moment, saying, well, it's very complicated. There are many things we have to do. It's not about a slogan. But actually, it was really helpful when I finally got to that, boiled it down to the big insight. And I think that should be growth.
That goes back to something we discussed a few weeks ago when this was before Keir Starmer did his reset speech, when I said I thought they should sort of, take a deep breath, analyse the last few weeks and months, and then come back in the new year with the plan for growth. Here is the plan for growth, almost like a big set piece event. Now, it's difficult to do that now because it will look like what the media will call another relaunch. But I still think if growth is the big thing,
it presumably should be, shouldn't it?
Well, it should be for two reasons. One, because the economy is in a bit of a mess, and two, because they said it was going to be.
Right.
And even though, as we said at the time of the budget, they were specific about taxes they were definitely not going to raise and quiet about the others, but the impression has been created and landed that they said they weren't going to put up taxes, and they have. They said everything was funded, but now it seems there's this black hole, and therefore winter fuel payment, etc. So, but I think actually it is still important that they come back in the new year, and this is the plan for growth. Here are the chapters of the plan for growth. Here is where we're addressing industrial strategy. Here's where we're doing skills. Here's where we're doing Europe. Here's where we're doing all these different things that relate to growth, and give themselves a kind of big route map that takes them through the next 12 months. And then, because, I was speaking to a minister a couple of days ago who was saying, you're sounding to get a bit grungy on the podcast. And I said, well, yeah, I am getting a bit grungy. And he said, look, just relax a bit. We've got 4 years. And I said, listen, you haven't got 4 years. This is a period where there's pre-delivery. We used to talk about, in 1997, Tony had this phrase, post-euphoria, pre-delivery. And it did get very kind of negative in terms of the overall mood. And you have, during that period, that's when an awful lot of opinions are being formed that are very hard to shift once they set. So the second half of the parliament is when you can begin to think about, the next election. Right now should be absolutely focused on this idea of a route map. Where are we going month to month, quarter to quarter, year to year? Now, I think they're doing parts of it well. And I know Keir doesn't like this idea of what I call the narrative arc of a parliament, but you need one.
Why doesn't he? What's he got? I mean, it seems to me completely central. I mean, even someone like me who can be a bit too verbose and a bit technocratic, I really concluded that my big lesson is narrative has to be tied to action. And there's a reason for that. The point that I try to make to him is that it's not, as he might be tempted to think, just a question of sort of cheap spin to the media. It's totally essential for leading and managing the government itself. That narrative is almost more important internally than externally. It's the thing that makes everybody at their desk understand this is what we're aiming for. This is where we're going.
Yeah, and I think because he feels that the way that he's done the job so far, he's done it by being this hardworking, serious, sensible, steadfast. These are all good qualities, by the way. Don't get me wrong. They're good qualities. And I think he thinks that people are trying to make him something that he's not. They say, well, that's what Tony Blair did. That's what Bill Clinton did. That's what Macron was doing. He's not that style of politician. But I think for the government as a whole, and you're absolutely right, this is for internal communications as well as external public communications. You have to have this sense of that everybody inside the government knows what the whole of government is about and trying to do. And I still feel they're struggling to get to that. Now, their one big advantage, Rory, is that they've still got with an main opposition party that seems to be struggling to find its feet as well. So what's your New Year resolution for the Conservative Party?
Well, the Conservatives are in crisis.
So when you say crisis, do you think that is an existential threat?
Close to a threat to its existence, because the crisis is about whether they essentially merge with Reform.
Right.
And what's happening is that a lot of their major funders are holding the money back. They don't feel there's anywhere for their money to go. And the most live debate is what to do about Farage. It's this extraordinary situation where Farage, with 5 MPs, appears to have more momentum, more clarity than the Conservatives with well over 100. And it's a situation where, despite the fact that Conservatives lost far more seats to Lib Dems and Labour than they did to Reform, they're totally obsessed with Reform. And Kemi Badenoch has really got to find that oxygen. She has to find a way of making sure that Farage seems irrelevant and that she's the leader of the opposition, not him. And how does she do that? I think she's firstly got to get out of her comfort zone. So instead of doing interviews with the Spectator, she should be doing an interview with the rest of politics. Secondly, I think that there is an absolutely golden opportunity to nail Labour now on growth in the economy. If Labour doesn't manage to do what you're talking about in the beginning of next year, there's a really good story for the Conservatives to tell that this Labour government is failing to make the investments, failing to reform, putting money into wages and unions. And I think there's also a gaping hole in defence, international security, foreign policy, where again, there's a good Conservative message about investing in the armed forces, Britain playing a bigger role in the world. So she should take that opportunity, and I can't see her yet taking it. What do you think she should do?
This relates to what I was going to say, that I think the New Year's resolution should be, which is to be serious. I think at the moment, I think on defence and foreign policy, actually, the Labour government's been pretty good. I think John Healey's very effective as defence minister. I think he's saying and doing the right things. I think that David Lammy's actually been pretty good. And I think they both come across in the jobs that they're doing as being serious. Whereas I don't get that sense from, as a whole, from the shadow cabinet, notwithstanding that, our friend Andrew Mitchell is very good. But I'll tell you what I think in relation to what you've just said. So I'll give you an example of what I think she should say and do. There's no way that they can sort of turn around and say, but we would invest more in defence, because even though it irritates the public that Labour keep banging on about the inheritance that they got from the Conservatives, it's true. They left a complete mess. And if I were Kemi Badenoch, I would own that. I would say, look, I'm not going to deny we left an absolute mess on so many fronts, and we all have to take responsibility for that. But now the challenge that I face as the new leader of the Conservative Party is, what would I do now? How would I rebuild the economy now? And here's a new set of ideas. How would I shape a new foreign policy now? And here's a different approach to the one that we did before. But I think this has been her weakness in Prime Minister's questions so far, it's almost as if the last government never happened. And the world started 6 months ago when the Labour government was elected. And I just don't think that can be effective. So she should own, this may sound counterintuitive, but she should own the perceived and real failings of the last government and use that as her lever for change.
She did more of that than Robert Jenrick, didn't she? Because I remember her speech began with apologies.
Yeah.
I mean, however unfair it is to Labour, tactically, it's inevitable. She's got to say, I'm really sorry, we fucked up, and this is the way that I'm going to turn it around. And I inherited a dismal situation, but here's the new plan, and this is the way in which we're going. And it's that we're not yet feeling.
Yeah.
And she's got to work out what on earth she's doing with reform, because I think that's the thing to just keep watching. Reform is now, in opinion polls, ahead of both Tories and Labour.
Well, in some. Let's not overstate it.
In some. But that's almost more of a problem internally within the Conservative Party than it is for Labour. Labour's not it doesn't really have the option of being reform. But the Conservatives have that kind of dangerous temptation. Last one on the UK before we move on to some good international stuff. How do you think the Lib Dems get more traction in the national debate? And I'm going to let you talk about that because I've got absolutely no idea what to do about Ed Davey.
But he was your runner-up in Politician of the Year. He was beaten only by Nigel Farage in your eyes. This is not going to surprise you, but it'll probably go down like a bag of sick with them. I know that, as you said, the Tories were more under threat from the Lib Dems than Reform when we're looking at the last election, and where the reason he fought the campaign he did. I'm not talking about the silly, funny stuff, but on the policy and the messaging was much more focused at sort of, soft Tories, as it were. I think the Lib Dems need to properly lead the debate on the impact of Brexit. I just don't understand why they've gone quiet on it. You and I, how many events have you and I done between us this year? I did an event the other day with a law firm, and it was a mixture of adults. It was a sort of bring your kids thing. It was adults, kids, and I did my usual thing. How many people here think Brexit's been a success? Zero. And that's the same wherever you go, north and south.
This law firm, for their family Christmas party, instead of getting Santa Claus, got you to talk about Brexit.
And they absolutely loved it.
Were the toddlers not a little bit disappointed when they were turning up?
Well, the youngest was a young boy. He was only about 6, but some of them, they were mainly...
Imagine, I tell you what my kids would think if they turned up for the company Christmas party and instead of getting Santa, they got Alastair talking to them about the single market.
You're constantly dragging your kids off to see exhibitions of Tibetan carpets and the like. I mean, Anyway, they were also inviting schools in. I'm going to give them a shout out. It was Pinsent Masons, and they have relationships with local schools, so the kids came in from the schools as well. Anyway, my point is, every single one of them thought Brexit was going badly, and it was a bad thing. And yet you have just last week, Keir Starmer rightly setting up some sort of unit in government to talk about how do we get closer relationship on trade with the European Union and break down some of these barriers that have been set up. And you have the idiot Johnson out saying, we've got to fight to stop the Brexit sellout. I actually think for the Lib Dems, the growing influence of Reform in the debate, Reform being a classic populist party that doesn't really have serious thought through policy positions. It has positionings which it exploits for politics, and that has sort of negativized the debate in terms of how that debate is conducted. Actually, the Lib Dems saying, can we stop focusing on this debate on a set of myths, and can we actually focus on fact and reality? And I think that would give them traction.
And their tactical problem, presumably, is that they ran a campaign which was all about focusing on very much doorstep local issues, and it was triumphantly successful. They got a lower percentage of the vote than they got under Nick Clegg, but enormous numbers of seats. And they deliberately didn't really have big national policy issues. It was all about, cleaning up the waterways here, working with this community hospital. So the question is Ed Davey as a leader going to be able to transition, having had this enormous success following one strategy? Is he going to be able to become a national leader? No, I would say that is their opportunity. And that's, with the Conservatives this week, this could be an enormous, and Labour week could be an enormous opportunity for a really dynamic Lib Dem leader to really do a kind of Macron and establish themselves properly in the centre ground and roar into the next election, dominating the airwaves.
It could be to take a big issue and basically say, I'm sick to death of living in a political system where the debate that we have is really not focused on what is actually happening, but on these political myths created by these charlatans like Farage and Johnson. I'm going to tell you the facts about this, and I'm going to hammer them. Because as an opposition party, you need campaigns. Now, what are the Lib Dems right now campaigning on? I don't know.
And I'm afraid you need to stop at this point appearing in Santa hats. I mean, enough already. We've got the point. He's funny. He does bungee jumps. He does this stuff. But he needs to now start positioning himself as a potential man in government in 4 years' time. And that involves getting rid of that stuff.
You can't have watched it because otherwise you'd have raised it. I presume you didn't see him on Have I Got News for You?
Oh, no. Oh, no. Oh, no. Oh,
right.
No.
Okay. Let's go from Have I Got News for You to another celebrity politician in the form of Donald Trump. How worried should we be after January the 20th when Donald Trump becomes president?
The answer is very, very worried, because America really matters to the world, and because he's coming into a world which is much more dangerous and unstable than it was in 2016-17 when he took over last time. So the whole post-war system believes that the way that you stop wars, stop the First World War, Second World War, was based on four things. One of them was making sure that there was open trade, so economies were interlinked. And the great example there, obviously, is Germany, France, where they decided that the way to avoid going to war again was to get into this European Union. The second thing that people decided is that you needed generous international assistance to rebuild economies. And that was the Marshall Plan. That was rebuilding Germany and Japan after the war. The third thing was the setting up of this rule-based international order, which was the International Court of Justice and eventually the International Criminal Court and the UN and all these attempts to try to create an international system with rules. And those rules were around respecting borders, so Putin not invading Ukraine, but also respecting human rights, which is, doesn't matter if you're a Western ally or not, you should be held accountable if you commit war crimes. Yeah. And the final thing was American hegemony that put this whole thing together. And I think the problem with Trump is he hits every single one of those four things. He replaces open trade with protectionism. He replaces a rule-based international order with cozying up to tyrants. He replaces development and support for other countries with cutting development aid and America first. And he puts America into an isolated position that's undercutting the world order. Over to you.
I think it's potentially horrific. I was talking to somebody who was trying to explain to me, and somebody who is not naturally Republican but did vote for Trump, who was trying to explain to me why he thought that he is not going to be as bad as we thought this time. That last time he wasn't very, very, very well prepared, and it was all totally chaotic. This time he's much better prepared, and he's doing what classic sort of art of the deal negotiation of staking a very, very tough position on all sorts of difficult issues. And then he's going to sort of, wind his neck in a fair bit. I don't know if that's right or wrong. I do think on Ukraine, the one interesting thing I took out of that interview he did not long after the election, he was definitely signaling a kind of change of tone on Ukraine, either to the one that he was pursuing the election or that the ones that the real kind of, the J.D. Vances who say have nothing to do with it was saying. So it may be that he'll be different. I think his economic stuff, if he goes ahead with the sort of, tariff is the most beautiful word in the English language line that he had during the campaign, I think that could be a disaster for the world economy. But again, is that sort of part of a, I'm the tough guy, get used to dealing with me approach to things? I don't know.
Predicting the American economy is a mug's game. And people predicted, people I admire immensely, like Larry Summers, predicted recessions and inflation that didn't happen. But it is true that he's taking over an American economy that's very different from 2017 because there's higher inflation and interest rates are higher. So if he decides to push ahead with tariff barriers, which will drive up the cost of goods, 110% import tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles or 60% general tariffs on Chinese goods, if he does that, if he throws out 11 million undocumented migrants, illegal immigrants, that will create a labor shortage crunch. If he begins spending like Billy-O on defense and cutting taxes very dramatically, that'll roar up the deficit. So the worst case scenario you could see is that you end up with inflation taking off, the cost of servicing the debt taking off, and America finding itself in stagflation, finding itself in a situation where it's got inflation and recession at the same time.
Yeah.
We're not really factoring that in. And I don't know what percentage chance you put on that. Is that 20, 30% chance? But my gut is that too many of the kind of people that we meet working in the markets have been so excited by the fact that the stock markets responded positively to Trump and that they see him as a business guy. And they're focusing too much on the appointment of the Treasury Secretary who reassures them because he's a hedge funder, and not enough on the Thomas Homan, Stephen Miller stuff, which is the appointment of these much more right-wing, anti-immigrant, pro-tariff, more aggressive figures within the administration. So, and that will change a lot of things because we're in a conversation in Europe where we've gone from 5 years ago thinking we all need to be like Germany to thinking we all need to be like the US. Now that will cease if the US economy begins to falter.
Yeah. How worried did you think we should be about Musk? Anthony Scaramucci, who I like a great deal, and we love his podcast with Katty Kay, but he did get something very, very badly wrong in the past because he told me absolutely, hand on heart, it's not going to happen. Donald Trump will never, ever be president again. Now he's saying to us, hand on heart, Trump and Musk, it's done. It's finished. Musk is, he's just pandering now. I'm not convinced about that. I get the sense that Musk is really, really locked in there and is very, very powerful within it. And one of my favorite tweets towards the end of the year from our friend Tommy Vita at Pod Save America, I personally think having a ketamine-addled billionaire oligarch deciding which bills get passed by Congress is a great way to run the government. You know what's really weird about these right-wing people is that, and I know social media is not a great place for irony, it's not great, but when Tice and Farage and Rupert Lowe and these people were all saying absolutely nothing wrong. If Elon Musk wants to give $100 million...
Just for listeners, these are all the reform MPs.
The reform guys, yeah. Why are we getting so excited? These are the same people who used to sort of invent conspiracy theories about George Soros buying elections around the world, and this was terrible. So in response to this, I did this tweet. Breaking news. French billionaire Jean Le Riche and German industrialist Hans-Dietrich Geltmann have decided to donate 200 million euros to a new campaign to get Britain back into the European Union after the disaster of Brexit. I'm happy to announce I will be campaign director. I'm sure that Nigel Farage will see nothing wrong with this at all, common sense in it. You would not believe how many people took that seriously. One of them actually said, your podcast should be called The Rest is Hypocrisy. Why is it wrong for Musk to do this, but it's okay for this French and German couple to do it? I mean, absolute madness. But the principle is, that is the principle. If it is okay for Elon Musk to give money to reform, then it's okay for French people, Chinese people, Russian people.
Before we get on to the sort of bigger issue of Musk, campaign finance reform in the United Kingdom.
Oh, got to happen.
Work backwards, absolutely necessary. If it is even theoretically possible for somebody to give 100 million to any party, it should be stopped at once.
Well, for an American citizen to do it, it should be stopped for £5.
Our elections at the moment go at about 10, 20 million pounds. 100 million pounds coming in is completely insane. It would be like aged 18 sitting down to the poker table and suddenly realizing that one of the people sitting down to the poker table is able to put £10,000 on the table when you're all betting a fiver. I mean, It's mad, and we need to change the rules to prevent that from happening. I think Musk is more of a threat than Trump. I think he's a genuine fascist. I think that he is somebody who loves the idea of being connected to stirring up a massive political movement. He loves the propaganda tool, and he's showing the power of social media. X is a small platform with a few members, but he's doing something with it that nobody's tried to do with social media before. We saw with Facebook and Twitter in the Arab Spring that it was dangerous, but in those days, it was still just about pretending to play by the rules. If you put a weapon like that in the hands of somebody who actually wants to promote tweets from far-right groups in Germany, Austria, troll the British Prime Minister, fan a vision of anti-immigration, anti-climate, anti-development aid, you're doing something which is extraordinary. It's like the 100 million pounds coming into the British election. And I think nobody should underestimate Musk. I think he's incredibly clever. He's very, very ruthless. Look what he just did in backing Californian policies. He backed a Californian policy on restricting his rivals so that he could then boost his business in Texas. And he's been like that ever since he was at PayPal. So I think he'll stick with Trump because he's actually a pragmatic businessman and a very ruthless businessman, and he thinks being close to Trump is going to allow him to get away with this crazy fantasy.
And does Trump stick with him? I mean, the mooch is convinced that Trump has already sort of decided he's outlived himself. And I saw that guy, Adam Kinzinger, the former Republican who sort of turned against Trump. He has started to call Musk President Musk and Vice President Trump. And that's how he now defines them. Right. Which is a clever way of undermining both Trump and J.D. Vance.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's right. I think the more you lean into the idea that Elon Musk is the first husband, the more you can begin to irritate both Musk and Trump.
But just on the funding thing, when Kamala Harris was up against Donald Trump, I had so many people saying to me, why can't we donate? This is an election that matters to us as well. But you cannot, as a British citizen, you cannot donate to an American politician.
Yeah, two principles, isn't there? There's it should be a British citizen. The second is, even if it's a British citizen, nobody should be able to give 100 million.
Yeah.
Even if they wanted to.
Yeah.
It's completely grotesque. And we need to stop a Conservative Party being funded by hedge funds, oligarchs, and a Labour Party being funded by trade unions, and all of them being in hock. And we need to move, I think, to something that everybody hates, which is state funding of political parties or very, very strict restrictions on how much you give.
Yeah. Now, what about Europe, Rory? Here's a starter for 10. Who do you think will be the German Chancellor after February the 23rd?
We know the answer to that because you've told us the answer to that, and you're presumably 99% on that. So tell us who'll be the next German Chancellor.
Well, probably Friedrich Merz, who's the leader of the Union, this Christian Democrats and CSU, the Bavaria Party.
And the great survivor, Alastair, as we picked up in the Angela Merkel interview, because he was her rival back in the day, 20 years ago.
Yeah, when Stoiber was the kind of the Chancellor candidate, hovering in the background, you had Angela Merkel and Friedrich Merz, and they didn't really get on that well. Merz is is to the right of. He's probably more of a conservative than Angela Merkel. there's a part of Merz that I like, Rory, which is, I know how obsessed you are with politicians and their hair. And
Yeah.
you may know that I really don't like this bit of my hair, this sort of, this will mean nothing to you, but this sort of Steve Claridge thing that comes down the front of my forehead. But Merz, if you look at him, he's got this in isolation from the rest of his hair. So he's sort of bald, but with this little sliver at the front. But I think he's going to win. I think it's well ahead in the polls. But listen, we're living in such volatile times that you can't rule anything out. Scholz really does look like a man who thinks he can do something in this campaign.
But is he a sort of, interesting, isn't he? He can look a bit from a distance like a kind of Biden figure. He's almost 70. He's got there by just hanging around and never giving up in the way that Biden did, who kept losing his chance. So Biden obviously ran for the presidency many times, beginning in the 1980s, never really worked out, just kept plugging along and eventually came through. And Merz is an older guy who you get a bit of that sense as somebody who's just stuck with it, been in the system, made it through. Or am I underestimating him? Has he got more of an edge to him than Biden had?
Yeah, I think so. I think he's getting on towards 70. He's got a lot of energy. He's definitely got energy. He's pretty strong in Ukraine. I think what both of them have, but of course it's back to our thing about incumbency, it's much easier for the person out of government than the person in government. Neither of them are really articulating a strategy that says that the German economy, which we all used to think was kind of humming away nicely, is going to get back on track. But I'll tell you the other thing that's really been interesting in the election so far, much, much, much more robust campaigning, more aggressive campaigning than the Germans maybe are used to. And I wonder again whether that's the influence of the Alternative for Deutschland and the way that they campaign.
And presumably one of the things that we may see and to look at as we go into this is what happens to the AfD on the right and what happens to the far left, the Wagenknecht party.
Yeah. Well, listen, it's a totally different voting system. Whoever wins, in quotes, will have to form some sort of coalition with other parties. I think it's possible that you end up with a grand coalition between the CDU and the SDP, but that's why the nature of the campaign is maybe interesting. But look, it's going to be one of the most important elections in 2025, and I could be wrong, but I think Merz will be the next chancellor. Now, what about France, Rory? Bayrou, at the time of recording, is the prime minister. They had 4 in 2024, but can you see that lasting?
Yes, I can't, I'm afraid, but it may be that I'm just becoming a French bear. It's true that, they have had this thing called cohabitation in the past, occasionally, but it's a very unstable situation. Their constitution, de Gaulle's constitution, basically creates this super powerful president and assumes that they're going to be able to work with the parliament, with the prime minister. And Macron, by triggering this election, has created this situation where I can't see how you keep things going if fundamentally either the far right under Le Pen or the far left under Mélenchon can pull the rug out from under you almost whenever they want, or rather they can together if they decide to do it together. So I guess he's trying again, but I can't really see why you would be more optimistic about this than you would be about Barnier, who only managed to last a few weeks.
This is what happens with elections, and maybe particularly snap elections, is that the numbers, when the way the numbers fall, that's what the politicians then have to pick up, and the numbers just don't work. The difference with cohabitation was having a president of, like, I remember with Chirac and Jospin, a president of one party, a government headed by the other. What Macron seems to be doing is trying to get prime ministers that essentially he wants them to be pretty much in his political space. Barnier to the right, Bayrou in the centre, but maybe leaning a little bit more towards a bit more in the en même temps category of politics. But look, France is going to be so interesting this year because, of course, Macron certainly doesn't strike me as the sort of guy who's going to throw in the towel early. He's got the whole of this year and a fair bit of the next before he has to go to, leave office. So can you keep having sort of changes of prime minister? Does it become a bit like, Italy used to be a laughing stock changing its prime minister the whole time. We were a laughing stock changing the prime minister the whole time.
Yeah, but people point out that actually the problem is that it's more of a problem in France because France is so heavily centralized on Paris.
Yeah.
Belgium, you pointed out, I think, in the podcast, has had a lot of prime ministers and frequent moments where it doesn't have government. But I then got called by a Belgian friend who said, yes, but in Belgium, there's a much, much stronger decentralized, devolved state system going on. It matters much less. Whereas France, everything is drawn into the center, everything's drawn into Paris. And if they can't get a functioning relationship between prime minister, parliament, and the president, France is in much more trouble than these other countries. And of course, the French president matters much more for Europe than the Italian prime minister or the Belgian prime minister.
Yeah. Have you heard of Patrice de McMahon, who sounds like he ought to be a Scot, McMahon, but in fact, his family, going way back, descended from a former High King of Ireland. But Patrice de McMahon was president of France, and in 1879 he resigned after a similarly ill-advised decision to have a snap election. Although ironically, he was doing it because he wanted Parliament to have more power than they then had vis-a-vis the powers of the president. So, Rory, I think this time last year, or was it this time 2 years ago, but you were sort of pretty sure that China-Taiwan was going to kick off.
I think what I've said is, I think consistently, but people can call me up, is that there is a very big chance of it kicking off. So I keep trying to say 30, 40%, which is a way of saying, I'm not saying it's certain that it's going to do it. In fact, it's probably less than 50%, but people are underestimating the risk that as the Chinese economy struggles, as Xi Jinping looks to try to regain popularity with his working class base, nationalism becomes quite appealing. And a lot of that, I think, will depend on his calculation of whether the Chinese military is ready and his view on how the world is going to respond. And if he thinks the world is in a relatively soft place where people aren't going to want to get into a cycle of sanctions and counter-sanctions with China, then there's no doubt in my mind that he sees part of his legacy being reincorporating Taiwan into China, although he'd prefer to do it non-militarily.
And do we think that Trump's arrival makes China more or less likely to think that going after Taiwan is feasible?
I think you're getting into this very strange question of mindset of very isolated leaders. So Xi Jinping's now in for life, already part of a Politburo, and he will be guessing on the basis of pretty uncertain intelligence how Trump will respond. I mean, after all, you and I don't really know how Trump would respond because he's got two competing instincts in his mind. Mm-hmm. He hates being humiliated, which might mean that he wants to show strength. But he's got another very, very strong isolationist view, which is this is none of our business. And let me put it in really blunt terms. The only way of deterring China from going into Taiwan is with the US, and that means US aircraft carriers. A US aircraft carrier turns up, it's sunk by Chinese drone attacks, 3,800 US servicemen die instantly. Is Trump, the Trump that saw the Iraq and Afghan wars as terrible wastes of time and energy, going to want to explain to the American people why he's just lost nearly 4,000 lives defending an island that will feel a very long way away from the United States? So I tend to the view that Trump will bark, but in the end, he's not going to want to deploy America militarily against China.
Middle East, more or less optimistic than 2024 New Year about the possibility ever of a peaceful two-state solution?
I think very unlikely to see, sadly, immediately a two-state solution. Might happen, but it would be a miracle because Netanyahu, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir have no interest in a two-state solution. Trump's new ambassador, Huckabee, has no interest in a two-state solution. I don't understand why Israel is continuing to bomb Gaza. I can't see what the strategic importance of that is, apart from some strange internal negotiation with the right wing of Netanyahu's government. I think Trump will want the violence to cease, and he'll try to put together some kind of version of his Abraham Accords. But I think it's very unlikely that Saudi Arabia is going to play ball because the vast majority of the Saudi population is unbelievably angry and alienated by what they've seen in Gaza. And I think they're very unlikely to feel that they want to make peace with Israel at this moment. So I can't see a two-state solution coming. But let me throw something else back. I mean, one of the problems is these sort of crazy unknown unknowns. We've just seen in Syria how a situation that seemed static for 7 years changed in a week. It's perfectly conceivable that we could see stuff that nobody's talking about. We could see the Iranian regime collapse. And the Iranian regime could collapse in two directions, could collapse in a positive direction, it could collapse in a negative direction. It's also perfectly possible that we could see things spreading. The sort of movement that we're seeing in Syria could spill over towards Iraq or Lebanon. We could see Turkey reemerge as a player. I mean, this is in some ways a Turkish success. So a Trump world where America withdraws more could be a world next year of middle powers, Saudi, UAE, Qatar, Turkey, playing not just in the Middle East, but in the Sahel, in the Horn of Africa. Anyway, over to you.
It sort of feels very bubbly, this kind of American economy vibe at the moment. I wonder whether that's going to hold. And I don't understand. I can't pretend to be a great understander of the whole crypto world, but it feels very, very fragile to me. So I wonder whether there won't be something of a crash in the US this year. Now let's finally, Rory, on Ukraine. Will Ukraine be the same Ukraine territorially at the end of 2025 that it is now?
I think that depends on whether you think Europe or bits of Europe are going to step up. So a lot depends on whether Poland, Nordic, Baltic countries, and the UK step up.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that
signs on that are pretty good, I'd say.
Yeah, but interesting. I mean, is it significant that Keir Starmer hasn't visited Ukraine when Johnson and Rishi Sunak were perpetually going there?
But John Healey, the Defence Secretary, was there shortly before Christmas and announcing a whole new package of support. I think Poland is really interesting in this regard. I think Poland has really stepped up in terms of his commitment. The whole sort of talk is that Trump will offer some kind of, bit of land, a bit of non-NATO commitment, whatever it might be. But I'm not convinced. I think there's a chance that provided Europe does hold firm, there's a chance that Ukraine will be the same.
There's a very interesting thing at the centre of the Labour government that we don't talk about very much, which is that John Healey, as you say, has been a great Defence Secretary, and we've got a leading interview coming up with Ben Wallace, who pays tribute to him. But one of the appointments that maybe people who aren't being geeky haven't focused on very much is Alastair Cairns, who's a junior defence minister. So Alastair Cairns is extraordinary. I mean, he's a very, very unusual politician. He is a amazing fighting Royal Marine. I mean, he's a real operations guy who played a very, very central role in what the United Kingdom was doing in Ukraine, which he doesn't talk about. But he's probably the most serious operational fighting soldier that's been in the British Parliament almost since the Second World War. And he's right there in the MOD. Now, he's not been given a big operational role. He's been given a veterans role, which is a bit eccentric for somebody who's like an absolute kind of warrior. But that's a very interesting addition to the team, and maybe a sign that, I don't know, maybe reading too much into it, that Britain may lean in more operationally into Ukraine.
Okay, Rory, final thing for 2025, reasons to be cheerful.
Okay, let me just, before I go cheerful, I'm going to go really gloomy and then I'm going to go cheerful. So really gloomy, sometime we should talk about the significant risk of a dirty nuclear bomb going off in one of our cities. And we should talk about North Korea flinging nukes around. But reasons to be optimistic. I think if Europe sees Trump's retreat as a reason to step up, and it begins to actually take more responsibility for defense and security, and the new German chancellor comes in with a bit of momentum behind him, it's likely to be him, and forms a good alliance with Keir Starmer, you've got two big European economies that could begin to frame something, not within the European Union, but maybe with Poland, with Donald Tusk. And we've got the presidential election coming in Poland next year. Things could begin to come together where actually this could be the beginning of Europe standing up a little bit more, doing a bit more in the world, and that probably would be a good thing.
Okay, well, my reason to be cheerful is, Rory, that things can only get better.
Great.
Well, listen, have a lovely new year. I'll no doubt be seeing lots and lots of you through the year. Thank you to everybody who listened and watched last year and will listen and watch this year.
Have a very happy new year, everybody. Bye-bye.
See you soon. Bye.